Welcome to today's episode of the Medical Device Marketing Podcast. So today we're talking about usability, testing, and I'm here with Professor Clutton-Brock. Professor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for having us. So to start off with, many people who are listening to the podcast will know who you are and your background, but could you just introduce yourself for those who don't know?
Yes, no, that would be a pleasure. So I'm Tom Clutton-Brock. My proper job is Professor of Anaesthesia in Intensive Care Medicine at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. But to be clear, I don't work clinically anymore. I did for many years, but I stopped nearly 8 years ago after a back injury. But my academic side of my career has been almost entirely in medical devices. And I've been extremely lucky to be able to continue full-time doing that when I gave up clinical work. So I'm the clinical director of two organisations. One is government-funded through the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the NIHR, and I'm the director of one of the 14 health tech research centres. And we specialise in devices, digital and robotics. And alongside that, very closely linked, was originally a European-funded project, which is the Medical Devices Testing and Evaluation Centre, which was a bespoke, high-fidelity simulation centre built solely for usability testing of novel medical devices.
And one thing I have to ask you about as well, which we were talking about earlier, is you did also receive an MBE in 2021? Yeah.
Yes, I did. Officially that was for services to the NHS during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was a huge privilege. But important to remember, it's very much a teamwork. And actually, interestingly, two members of that team were my daughters, because they were undergraduates at university. They'd had to come back from university because of COVID, and they were being a bit of a nuisance at home. And of course, I couldn't isolate from them. So I thought, well, you might as well come and help. They're both history graduates, actually. One very capable with a film camera, and one very good at spreadsheets and so on. So they came in every day, 7 days a week, for about 3 months. And what we did was we set up an independent testing facility for the ventilator challenge. So all the various companies that proposed technology to the UK government built prototypes, and we tested those here in a bespoke testing facility with simulated lungs, artificial breathing machines, and so on and so forth. And we're able to help advise the government about the suitability of that technology.
And so how many of the ventilators that you tested here moved forward to treat patients?
So they were sort of triaged, if you like. There were 14 in total. We didn't see one at all, and we saw one quite late on. In the end, there were a couple that were already in production, that they stepped the production up. But there was just one that was chosen to be manufactured in large numbers. And for something that would normally take 3-4 years to get through the regulations, within about 12 weeks, something like 12,000 of those have been built.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so to come back to why we're here today. So first of all, everyone will notice we're in a different place. So normally we're in our head office. Can you tell us a little bit about the institute that we're in today?
I can. So we're in the old original Queen Elizabeth Hospital, built in the 1930s. And where we're sat now originally was oncology wards when I first came here, and then turned into intensive care for many years. And then when the new hospital was built, intensive care moved up there. And the north side of the building was refurbished as an Institute for Translational Medicine, ITM, which it still is. But this floor wasn't done. And in fact, this was just a building site. And with the European money, this is the east side of the floor, we converted this into a specialised simulation suite. So we have our own operating theatre, which is where we're sat now. We have 3 bays that we can turn into intensive care bays, high dependency bays. We have a pop-up ambulance. We can set up GP surgeries. We can set up outpatients. We can set up pretty much anything. And it's fully equipped. And that's what we use it for. And it's one of very few facilities that are used like this in the world.
And so this is totally to help medical device companies for usability testing, for human factors testing.
It is. So the history of it, I worked for the regulator, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, for many years, very part-time, mainly in the sort of educational side. But when we analysed adverse incidents, at least in a third, the device had failed. It had broken or something had gone wrong. In a third, it was clear it hadn't been used properly. And in another third, we didn't know. I suspect many of those were usability errors. So it's clear that usability is a major component in device-related adverse incidents. And the regulator spotted this. So they started introducing a requirement for this, and an ISO standard, which we'll probably talk about in a bit more detail, came out to support that as well. And the standard required real users, which seemed pretty obvious really, in a realistic environment, which was the interesting bit. So you couldn't just take a hotel room or something and test your equipment there, but not on real patients, because of course it hasn't gone through regulatory approvals yet. So we decided we'd build a realistic environment that could be adapted, but that we wouldn't use humans. And so we have a family, expanding family, of very realistic phantom patients. And so that's what we did. And the idea was for particularly smaller companies, well, we work primarily with SMEs in the United Kingdom. We like technology to come very early stage, because if you've designed in faults, very difficult to design them out.
We spoke about this earlier and the cost of potentially designing them out later.
Yes.
Yeah.
And certainly if you get into clinical practice and you find that things are difficult to use, clinicians of all brands are very unforgiving. And once we've had a problem with something, we probably won't go back and use it again. So why not come to a secure, confidential, non-threatening, but also non-risky environment and test your technology out without the potential for harming patients at all?
So bringing it right back to actually, if people aren't familiar with what usability testing is or what human factors is, what are they, or how would you actually define them? You've sort of addressed it in what we've just spoken about. And what is the difference between the two?
So I think there's a big overlap between the two, really. I think usability is a subset of human factors. So there are lots of human factors, components, team working, for example, will be a very important part, which could be part of usability. But usability is very much attached to the device, I think, is a fair way of putting it. And it's a mixture of, are there things the device does that are difficult to get it to do? Is it easy to get it to do something wrong? And while instructions for use are clearly absolutely key here, and manufacturers use them, quite rightly, to protect themselves against use errors, but it's nice to have something that's inherently easy to use. You may have read the instructions for use for your car, but many people have not.
I haven't. I haven't.
No. And the majority of us could get in a car today and drive it reasonably safely, because the pedals are where we expect them to be. The wheels turn the same way when you move the steering wheel. The same is not true for medical devices. There are standards, but those standards are often not about how easy they are to use. So I think the usability is very user and device specific. Human factors is a broader area.
And within this institute here, you're looking at usability versus human factors, or do you look at both?
We look primarily at usability.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of other human factors. In fact, one of our theme leads is a human factors expert, but they would be more interested to see how things like the team put together and whether things were available and how long it took for results to come back and so on. Whereas we would focus much more on the technology.
Understood. So, so if we're looking particularly at devices, so that people can understand the implications of usability and why it's so important in medical device, can you share some examples of where usability has maybe gone wrong and what implications that has had?
Yes, I mean, I guess you'd expect me to be fairly general around that, really. Well, no, because it's important to stress for anybody in industry looking at this that everything we do everything under non-disclosure. And so everything we do would be entirely confidential. Now, the industry may choose to use some of that to support for marketing, for example. That's fine. It belongs to them. But we're obviously very confidential about what we do. But generically, an example from a little while ago would be the majority of the device was controlled through a touchscreen, except for the enter key, which was a big button off the screen. It's actually me using it. And I'm sitting there searching forever on this touchscreen for the enter key, and I can't find it. And there's this big green button flashing away in the corner, and someone finally goes, "It's the green button." I go, "Oh, yes, so it is." But in a hurry, and this was a critical device, in a hurry, those sort of things matter, really.
But I think that's a really important point, because it's not like, normally the environment is not calm, and these devices are used in high stress environments. So therefore it is important that it's very simple to use and you're not hunting around for a button or something like that.
I think that's right. I mean, and another one is, so we have our own critical care ventilator. A small amount of our equipment does actually occasionally go off to get used clinically. So it's kept serviced and kept in clinical use. So everything disappeared during COVID, as you might expect, really. We did get it back. But that's a fairly modern intensive care ventilator, and it has a big on-off switch on the front. It has a cover over it so it doesn't get knocked. If you switch it off, it doesn't switch off. It says, "Is that really what you want to do?" And you have to say, "Yes, that is really what I want to do." And that's because in the old days, ventilators just switched off, and they may take quite some while to come back on again. So assuming that someone will make that error and switch it off by mistake, it has a built-in safeguard to say, "Is that what you really want to do?"
And you said to me earlier, actually, when we were chatting, that usability isn't necessarily about understanding late or dealing laterally with how to stop somebody doing something. It's actually building it into the device. So how do you make it really hard for somebody to do something?
Well, I think that's absolutely key. And again, you talked about stressful situations, but to say, you're at cardiac arrest or something like that, you need to read the instructions for use. You think, if you've been to a cardiac arrest, the last thing you expect to do is read the instructions for use. So yes, and I would expect to be able to switch on any defibrillator
Hmm.
and defibrillate a patient without having been taught how to use it.
So why do you think these usability errors happen?
They happen for a number of reasons, I think. I think firstly, it's often not designed out at an early stage. So often the initial designs may be very clever design, but it's often not designed by people who are ever going to use it. I think users are often involved very late in the designs. And I think people are not always well enough trained. And one of my previous roles as the regulator was very into the whole business about device training. But I just don't think you can train out every error. We've talked about stressful situations. So I think it's the fact, I just don't think people think about it really. And the regulators now it's moving all the time, so it's changing. But there's no doubt that the regulators across the world are expecting you to show you've done some usability testing. A lot of that's done in-house. I think it's useful to go out independently and have it done because you don't see things necessarily in-house that someone outside does. We quite often get engineers saying, no one's ever going to do
You
that.
said this 3. Yeah.
And we'll say, here, have a look at this video. Here's 3 people doing exactly that. And I think it's useful to see that being done. So I think those are the main reasons. And I think both for regulatory approval, but also for post-market, both uptake and sustained uptake, then I think usability is important.
And when you talk about sustained uptake, we spoke about this earlier. So what do you mean by sustained uptake and how does usability impact that?
So, I'm not sure I can quote publications, but there's certainly a view that take surgical devices that have gone through the regulations, then probably less than 1% are still in use 5 years later. And that is a staggering wastage. It's not all usability, of course it's not. It's because other things come along or cheaper versions come along. But I think by sustained uptake, I mean something that really does make a difference to patients, does improve patient care. And it's not just safety and efficacy, it's also efficiency of patient care, a huge issue in the NHS at the moment. But I think for sustained uptake, it has to be something that moves with the times, that people find easy to use, they're happy to use, and doesn't result in a lot of errors. And so I think it's an important part, I think, of device uptake.
And if you have a really innovative device, it's really going to help patients moving forwards, and then its usage is limited because of usability, that seems like a real waste. So
Well, there's no question about that. And it may be slightly wider than just the device usability itself. So it's also how does it fit into a care pathway? So, you take a busy GP in a busy practice. They don't have the time to learn how to use a completely new piece of technology because they just don't have, nor do most clinical staff. So the more inherently easy it is to use, then I think the more likely it is to get used and to keep being used.
So if somebody was going to do usability testing here, how do you capture all the errors that people are likely to make?
So we divide our usability testing into 3 forms. The basic form, which we're beginning to do more of, are called expert reviews. So an expert review, we basically will take the technology. These are almost always, well, they are now pretty well universally done online. It's just much easier to engage clinical staff and patients online. So we'll have some slides that show the technology. We try not to have anything that's protected in there because it's quite difficult to get guaranteed non-disclosure from a large number of users. We will independently present that technology and then ask a series of directed questions such as, would you use this? What would you like to see differently? And so on. We record it with permission and we then make that recording and our notes available to the company. So they can put their technology, we would try and recruit 15 to 20 users. They can put their technology into 15 to 20 independent users and get proper, unfiltered feedback around that. So that's the first thing that we start doing.
And who would be a good audience for that? As in, who would be the good type of medtech company who would approach you for that? When in the life cycle would it make sense to do that?
As early as possible is the answer. And so we get a whole variety of things. Increasingly with digital and apps coming along to look at that, and if people just say, oh, it's just another one of these apps that does this, and then actually selling that if it does nothing different is going to be quite challenging. But if they say, look, if it just did this would really make a big difference.
So it's almost actually, it's similar to market research, slightly different, but it's similar to market research, but you're actually understanding if the value proposition has value. So what the device is, the device actually valuable to the end user, which is hugely valuable to the company to know up front as well.
I think that's right. When we occasionally questions of price come up, but we tend not to discuss that too much. I think my view around the cost of technology is it's massively variable. I mean, it's very volume dependent, for example. So we tend not to discuss costs in detail, but we do discuss where it would fit into clinical practice, and so on. And so that's the simplest thing that we do. They're relatively cost effective. They're
We
relatively
can talk
easy to
about that
set up.
later.
Yeah, they're relatively easy to set up. And then the ISO standard 62366 divides usability studies into formative and summative. Formative, we try and recruit between 6-12 users from different groups. And we'll put them through a fairly simple testing. So we'll say, attach this to the patient, get some readings. We video that, usually from multiple angles, and we ask them to talk about what they're doing. And then we'll have a structured interview at the end.
And do you put them in a high pressure situation? So you
It
try and make
varies.
it as
It just varies.
realistic.
The answer, we certainly do.
Yeah.
For things that are going to be used in a high pressure
Yeah.
situation. So because of the simulation facilities that we have, we can set up a very poorly patient in theatre. We've got one coming up with some software designed to help controlling blood pressure. It's been published. But we want to set up a poorly patient on the operating table, having a general anaesthetic. And we can set all that up. We have background sounds in theatre, so we can have the sounds of surgeons talking to each other and operations. We can have the alarms going off. We can have patient looking unwell. So we can certainly set up high pressure. Obviously, that's not necessary for everything. So that's the realistic environment is the important component. And then we would agree on a set of tasks that they're going to do. We consent all of our volunteers for video. If they don't want to be videoed, then obviously we respect that. If they don't want to be identified, then we'll pixelate faces out. But that's not very common. And we will record that. We agree a protocol before we do that with the company. And then we will do it independently. We do the testing. We do have the facility for companies to watch remotely. We don't use that very much. I think we feel it's better for us to do the testing without interference, if that makes sense.
And so that's interesting. So the companies tend not to be here.
They tend not to be here. We do have a meeting room we can connect through,
Right.
and we can live stream it. So in the ventilator challenge, we live streamed all the testing we did to make sure we were doing what they thought. We found it a little easier not to do that here. And then we'll write a written report with stills from the video. We'll edit top and tail the videos, and we make those available to the company. So that's formative testing. We have a guaranteed turnaround from our side of 12 weeks. It gets delayed sometimes because the tech isn't working or it doesn't arrive or something. And then much later in the product cycle, just to say, we'd often repeat that.
So just if I can jump in a second. So when you do the formative testing, at what stage does the product need to be in? And actually going back to the expert review as well. So if a company is listening to the podcast now and saying, I think this is really valuable, but actually my device just isn't ready. At what stage of readiness does it need to be there in order to do all the different levels of testing that we've just spoken about?
So it varies depending which level of testing you're doing, a certain amount. To be honest with you, for expert review and formative, expert review can almost be an idea. It's clearly not being attached to anybody.
So it could be like a CAD drawing or something
Absolutely,
like that.
and that's commonly what we have.
Okay.
Commonly have 3D drawings. We commonly don't have the actual thing, and then we'll have screenshots drawn on PowerPoint or whatever. So it can be very early stage. I think we do need to be convinced that there is some unmet clinical need for it, because clearly the time and resources are being put in, and we don't have unlimited resources. Formative, again, can be very early. Remember that we are not using patients. We're not using humans. So we don't require REC ethics approvals. We don't require health research approvals. We don't require any MHRA approvals. So we can start very early on. And the technology doesn't even have to work. I think for formative, it needs to be in the sort of looks like stage.
So people can actually just sort of simulate using it, even though not doing the full procedure with it.
Yes, I mean, if you go to a lot of the stuff we get 3D printed, but it needs to weigh. If we're going to move it around, it needs to be the right sort of weight. But it certainly hasn't got to go through any sort of 60601 testing or anything like that. So it can be very early stage. Formative, we quite like to do that more than once because we like to capture it again when the errors have been approached. Summative really should be at lockdown design. So it should be the design you're going to submit for regulatory approval, because it's a much more.
And how does summative change from a formative, from a testing perspective?
So largely in the number of people that we test it with. So we try and go 15 to 20 volunteers. Also, we have a much more complex protocol. So we try and spot all of the unenforced errors that would be made. We put those into a table, and then we look and see what sort of mitigation could be done to do that. What companies do with our report is it goes in the technical risk section of the technical file. and then they use it as part of risk mitigation. So they can say, we found that users do this, and we've done this to stop that from happening. But really, at Summative, you can't really then make substantial changes afterwards.
Okay. And if you do a summative and actually you realize there's a lot more errors than you thought there were because maybe you hadn't done 2 formatives, you'd just done 1 or something like that, you can go backwards again, or how does that work?
I think, again, I've got to get our position in all of this right. So our role is to do the testing. What the company does with that testing is up to them. But I think, generally speaking, most regulatory bodies, if you did what you called a summative and then made a whole pile of changes, they'd say you need to redo it. So we sometimes will stop halfway through a summative and say, look, there are just so many errors coming up. We think we should stop here, and you should go away and redesign it and then come back and redo it. So that doesn't happen very often, but I think that it's we do have, say, we make it clear up front that we will do that if we think there are too many errors.
So it sounds like there's an awful lot of systems involved in creating good usability studies, in the sense, we're talking about all the camera systems, the protocols up front. So if somebody is going to work with the team here, what does the process look like? So what could they expect? Like, what do they need to do, and what can they expect from your team? How does the whole process work? How easy is it for them, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think we made it as easy as possible. We have over the years we've been doing it. We've been doing quite a few years now. It certainly has progressed. I think it's become easier. So we'll have an initial engagement call. It would be unusual for us not to have an initial engagement call. Just occasionally we get approached by someone who doesn't seem to exist or something like that. So, and also we are hosted within an NHS trust, so we have to obey the trust's rules around who it will and won't work with. We are totally confidential. We wouldn't still be here if we weren't, and I think we have a reputation for being that. We now have a second stage where we have a business meeting to discuss whether we're going to progress or not. That depends a little bit on our workload. It depends how good a fit we think this is, how good the unmet need is, and also increasingly whether there's been any patient and public involvement. We accept there may not be at that stage, but if there has been positive engagement, that's a big plus for us.
And explain what you mean by that. So positive patient and public engagement. Do you mean by PR activities, or what do you mean by that?
Not quite so much that. It's really whether the company's made any effort to speak to patients or to charities or something like that represent them. We will do that. It's a big part of the work that we do. But I think to have some thought around that.
So it's really that you see that this device is viable.
Yes, I think it's the unmet need. Is there an unmet need? Does it meet that unmet need? I think that's important. Simply because we have more approaches than we can manage. We're getting busier and busier all the time. So then, having agreed that it's a project we like to progress, most of the time we're being asked to support raising income, raising money. Not always. There are some commercially funded projects, but most of them are raising funds.
So you work with very small SMEs or very small startups that actually aren't of course they're not commercial, but who really have very low budgets to start off with because they're looking to raise grants.
Yes. Basically, I mean, it's not unusual for the SME to be 3 people.
So it could be university spin-outs, or it could be venture-backed startups as well.
Probably more in the university spin-out side than in the venture capital side, but certainly from that side. And university spin-outs often have fantastic technology developed in physics or engineering, but absolutely no understanding of what the medical device route would be. So having agreed to progress, we'll exchange a non-disclosure. There's no financial commitment in that at all. It's entirely non-disclosure. And then we'll decide what they want to do, really, at the end of the day. And usually it's writing a grant application, which will contain some usability studies, which we will put some costs in for ourselves. And then the final bit of support we provide is we specialize in first-in-human clinical investigations, which is very different to usability, but also quite a specialized service.
And tell me more about that, because we've not spoken about that yet.
Basically, nowadays, particularly with the change in European regulations, and UKCA is clearly thinking of going along those lines, it would be unusual now not to be required to do a study in humans before you've got regulatory approval. Years ago, it was all done through equivalence and the predicate device route, but that's pretty well been shut off now. So the regulator will expect you to do a non-randomized prospective study around essential safety and performance in a relatively small number of patients. The reason it's different is you require all the normal approvals you require for research, but in the UK you require a letter of no objection from the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. And I think when I say there's an art, I mean, I do work for them. I chair the Interim Devices Working Group, and I have huge respect for them. They're very busy, but I think they want a protocol which they can send out to an expert that understands it, and in which you've thought about the risks. If you just say risks, none, that's never going to get you through. And so we have a lot of experience of writing those and getting the letters back quickly.
And so they're to get approval for the first in human.
Yes, and then they do the first in human study. It doesn't have to be done here. So quite a lot of studies we're supporting will help with the protocol, will help with getting the permissions, but the study may be done somewhere else. So it's not uncommon. I just think that there seems to be a lack of people that do a lot of them. A lot of universities have fantastic clinical trials units that do fantastically good work in large multi-center randomized studies, particularly around pharma, but it doesn't translate very well into medical devices.
And so it's helping those companies to really get into the industry, getting into
Yeah,
the
it's a mix. It's both companies and clinicians and academics. So it's a mixture of all sorts of groups in that.
So one of the questions that we get asked an awful lot, and I think is probably what people who are listening to the podcast are thinking about as well, is if somebody says, right, we want to engage to do a summative or a formative study or maybe a protocol for a first in human, what are the sort of costs associated with that?
So it's a question we get asked very commonly as well, as you might expect, really. I mean, the answer, I'd love to do it for free. I absolutely would. But the facility has cost us close to £10 million to build and costs in the region of £1 million a year to run. So I can't, basically, at the end of the day. I think perhaps we'll just start by saying what we have introduced is what we call an initial expert review. So I think when we're looking at going for a significant grant, by that I mean something like an NIHR Eye for Eye Product Development Award, in which you're looking at, possibly around about 1.5 million over 3 years, so a significant sum of money, then I think we feel that having an initial expert review, so a relatively small number of users around that, increases the chances of getting that award. So we're now offering those, not to everybody, we have to agree the unmet need and all that. We're offering to do those without charge because we think it increases our chance of getting some funding. But generally speaking, the expert review I've talked around is going to be around about the £15,000 mark. That does include writing the protocol, undertaking the whole review, and then writing all the results up. So there's quite a bit of work in that. So that's the sort of price that comes out at.
Okay, so moving forward, what about the formative review and summative?
So again, a standard formative review in which we have the equipment, basically, not the thing we're testing, obviously, because that needs to come, but we don't have to buy anything specific in, is around about the sort of £23,000-24,000 mark. The reasons that would change would be if we needed to buy some particular equipment. If it's very expensive, we'll rent it. So we've rented operating microscopes, blood gas analyzers, and so on. Occasionally, if we just need a different phantom, then we'll ask.
What's a phantom?
Sorry, so one of our pretend patients or bits of a patient. Sorry, if we don't have one, we have most. We've had one recently where we've been looking at labour induction. So we wanted a birthing phantom, which we didn't have, but we actually put 75% of the cost in ourselves, and the company put 25% in. But we've kept it. I think probably most companies don't want to know what to do with a birthing phantom. It just sits in a cupboard somewhere. It's probably not terribly helpful. But that's useful for us. So we will do that. So around about that sort of mark, unless there's some very specific piece of equipment we need to rent in. Summatives do vary quite a lot. So, I mean, they sort of vary, sort of probably even out around about the sort of 40, 45,000. I don't want to be too precise because things vary a little bit as things go on. That, again, will depend on how much equipment we need. We don't pay our volunteers. We never have done. And we do struggle to recruit. Everybody does. Everybody's very busy. But for lots of contractual reasons and other reasons, we like to say that we haven't paid our volunteers. What I would say about those costs is that we regularly get them funded through government grants. So clearly somebody thinks they're not unreasonable. And then the final one would be support for first in human. Those are coming out well over 50, probably closer to 55, 60. There's a lot of work involved in that. And that assumes that we're going to undertake the study as well. So there's all the NHS R&D approvals and so on and so forth. I suppose in the grand scheme of things and the cost of taking new technology to market, they're a smallish component. What they can do is save a huge amount of cost further down the line.
This is what we were talking about earlier, wasn't it? So, although it does seem like a lot of money, and actually a lot of companies who don't have that much money when they're coming to market, by not doing usability up front, you potentially have issues later, which then cause a huge amount more to address or even totally stagnate the adoption of your device.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think there's some natural truth to that. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily have to go out and research that. I think there's some natural truth that if you produce something that's difficult to use and people don't like it, they're not going to buy it.
So regulations. So we've spoken about, what usability testing will cost, how you do it, the types of programs you offer. How important are regulations now? So I know we spoke earlier about regulations are not as strong as they should be around usability, or not as they should be, but that it's not as regulated as well. So tell me more about regulations before approval and post-approval as well.
Yes, just to be clear, I'm not a regulatory expert. I chair the Interim Devices Working Group, but that's really as a sort of clinical expert, not as a regulatory expert. I have a working knowledge, should we put it that way. But we would absolutely always suggest that someone goes to a regulatory expert before they make any submissions. I think that's important because we don't do that. We don't write technical files, but we do help towards that. I think it's becoming more important. I think it's true. I've certainly heard the MHRA say that they will expect companies to have done a usability study unless they have a good reason not to have done. I suppose if it was a very straightforward technology like a new walking stick, let us say, you say it's a walking stick, I'm not really going to go out and do, or if you change the color or you change the packaging or something, even if you had to rechange your certification for that, you could make a good argument for not doing usability. But generally speaking, I think it's becoming the norm. We know the FDA are pretty much insisting on it now. There are some interesting debates about where the usability studies should be done. We think if you can demonstrate that you can recruit users that would be similar in other jurisdictions, that's fine. But there are, countries do things differently. We can set up some fairly international looking, the equipment that we use is pretty international, really. It's pretty much the same version everywhere. So I think the answer is that it's just getting more and more the case. You asked about post-market, which is interesting, actually. And when we set this up, I don't think we ever thought we'd ever do any post-market work. But we're beginning to do quite a bit more. So, for example, you'll have a product on the market and you'll get a number of reported adverse incidents. Now, they may not be hugely serious, but as you know, companies in various jurisdictions have a legal responsibility to report any adverse incidents back to them. And when you go to renew your CE certificate, UKCA, whatever, then it's the notified bodies and approved bodies are beginning to say, what are you doing about these user errors that you're getting up? And one approach to that is to go and do a usability study. So we're actually beginning to do, not huge numbers, but we are beginning to do more post-market usability studies. And I think that's a very interesting area.
I think the other interesting about usability, and especially post-market, so you have the pre-market usability where you can actually adapt your technology before you get to the summative review. But actually, if you still do have usability issues, it's also from a marketing perspective, it's how do we create not only standard IFUs, but how do we create materials that help to train people better? So actually you can get over some of those smaller usability issues that maybe aren't going to be changed in the design to prevent them happening later. So, not just the standard IFUs, how do we use video, how do we use things? And if you don't know they're there because you haven't done the usability at any stage, then you can't help people to address them either, which is, so I think that's another really interesting area around usability.
It is. And, for example, we can actually set up some intentional errors. So that would be virtually impossible to do in the real clinical environment. To say, look, we'd like you to make a mistake and we're going to video it. That's not going to happen in the clinical environment. We can do that. So we can actually generate those training materials here because we have the environment to do them in. But no, I agree with you. And again, we've talked about instructions for use. The problem is that, in the real world, there's a variety of different engagements with instructions for use. I think if you can design something that's inherently difficult to use wrongly, that has to be better than trying to iron it out through instructions for use. Of course, instructions for use.
Do you have any examples, additional examples, not just the turn off button?
No. I think one of them has been around packaging.
Yeah.
So one of them has been around the fact that if you change the you need to assemble things in the correct order. And it's important, and it's also possible to assemble them in the incorrect order. And if you do them in the incorrect order, they could be potentially dangerous. Now, you can have a video of that, you can have a picture of that, but if you package it so that you remove them, you can't remove the second one from the package until you've taken the first one out, and then it's obvious you then connect to the next one. You then take the next tray out, that's obvious you then connect to that one. So you can actually drive human behavior so that it actually does the right thing. Just because well, you can still do it the wrong way because you can take the bottom one out first, but we just wouldn't do that, would we? You'd take the first one out, then the second, then the third. So you can drive human. I mean, you can make the connections different and so on and so forth. But that's a very simple example whereby changing packaging, you can drive the correct behavior.
And so if somebody did usability testing with you here, would you give those recommendations following the usability testing?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's exactly that. So we do make some recommendations. I mean, we're a little careful not to step beyond our remit.
Yeah.
But we certainly if users have suggested that. And then we'll look at it, quite capable of adding our own comments around it. It's up to the company what they want to do. But we certainly would make some suggestions, and we certainly will say, look, if you did this, would this not just be easier thing to do? Because the errors, you'd be amazed how repeatable these errors are and how common they come back all the time.
I think it'd be really interesting to watch the videos because I think, as you said, engineers would say, oh no, but they wouldn't do that. And then the first thing somebody will do is exactly that. So, you just don't know what humans are going to do you? So actually doing usability testing, you can really just see it in real life.
You can. I mean, clearly you're not going to simulate every error because some of them are very rare. But I think you often users will say, but this would be easy to do this to, wouldn't it? And so you can say yes to that. We found the very engaging process, and we found the feedback from users has been very rich in many cases.
So there's probably questions that you get all the time from people who are looking to do usability testing. What are the top 3 questions that you get asked, and what is the answer? And I suspect cost is probably one of them, which we've already addressed.
Yeah, so cost is one of them. So perhaps I can have 3 others on top of
yeah,
cost.
you
Yeah,
can
that's
have
right.
3
Yeah, so yeah, cost is there, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually usually at the end of the conversation rather than that. I think one of them is often, do I need to do it and why do I need to do it? And we've discussed that in quite a lot of detail, I think, really. Secondly is, I don't know what to do. Can you help me do it? And the answer is yes, of course. We specialize in that. So I don't, companies will say, I don't know where to start. And we say, that's absolutely fine. We do. We'll send you something to read. And basically is how it works. And then I think the final one is, how long is it going to take? I think people are often surprised by the turnaround time that we have. Scheduling is probably becoming more of an issue. And then we'll say it's 12 weeks from when we start, but we are, we're pretty booked up now.
And that's for all studies is 12 weeks because you've got the formative and summative are different.
They are different, but we try and turn everything around within 12 weeks. The only times really we go over that are if we've got delays in things being delivered. The other one that comes up quite commonly, particularly if they're using single-use components, is how many do you need? So, you've got 20 users or something, and, small company building 20 prototypes is not an insignificant cost. But of course, they don't have to be sterile for us. We can repackage them. We can pretend to repackage them. We can stick more sticky tape on the back of it. We can do all sorts of things to reduce that number. We almost always want more than one because we'll use one for training and we want a backup. But we don't need large numbers of devices to test.
So they can come to you relatively early on.
I would just really encourage people to come early.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you'll sound, well, it was going to cost us millions to do that, or we paid for all the molding now. We can't change it.
Yeah, so you need to really start early.
Absolutely, because
and even expert review. So expert review is super early, and then formative is really when you have your first design that you think is ready to test.
I think as it looks like, as I said, really, not works like or doesn't, but looks like is good, really. Summative, then, I don't, I think, is the regulator going to demand a summative? I think that varies, is the answer to that. I think if it's a complex piece of technology, then the answer is yes. I think for a lot of things which are reworking of similar technologies, then probably formative is good enough.
Good. So if you, obviously a lot of our audience is marketing teams. So upstream and downstream marketing teams, predominantly downstream marketing teams. So, promoting to the outside world. What is the one bit of advice or one bit of information you would relay to marketing teams about the importance of usability testing?
I suppose it forms part of marketing information, if I'm honest about it. I mean, as you probably know, a lot of countries rely on the fact that, Dr. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so has used it or thinks it's a great idea. We do less of that in the UK. And we're always looking for clinical evidence. I mean, evidence-based. That evidence often comes quite late in devices and can be very expensive. I chair Interventional Procedures Advisory Committee at NICE, where we're looking at evidence of safety and efficacy, a lot of it around devices. But to get that is often several years down the line. So a lot of people want to know, has it been used on patients? But I think also we can provide the evidence to say it's been used by real users. And I think for marketing to say that the company has to agree to do this, it's their information. But if you said, look, would you like to see a usability report that's been done in 10 independent users in an independent center, and they've all come back and said, bar these few bits, this is really, really cool. I think that's quite a powerful market.
So you could even say 9 out of 10 users found it
9 out of 10
extremely
users
easy
found it
to
extremely
use.
easy to use, and the one that didn't, this is what we've done.
Yeah. That's really powerful. That is.
Because the information that we provide belongs to the company.
Yeah.
Including the videos.
And I suppose actually that can be done in the summative or post-market as well if you wanted to do that. And even if you had addressed an issue, then you can come and do usability again to get that type of data.
Yes. Absolutely. So repeating it after redesign. And so we do. I mean, we're basically open for business. As long as it's a legitimate business, we're pretty much, and people say, look, could we come and shoot some video of someone using this in a realistic environment? Well, the answer is yes. course they can. What we don't do is we don't just rent the facility out. So if you said, can I have the keys on Saturday? We don't do that. It's partly because the high value of equipment, we have a real defibrillator, all sorts of stuff. And so I think we feel a responsibility around that. So we've done a bit of work where we've rented it as a film set, but we have been here when we do that. So that's one of the things, to be clear, we don't do. By all means, people can bring human factors experts in. We're absolutely delighted to work with other teams. And by all means, they can design the whole protocol. But we do expect to be on site when it's being used.
So if somebody's listening and they think, I'd like to get in contact, what's the easiest way to get in contact with your team?
So the easiest thing really is to come through our HRC DDR website, which you can stick up on the screen so they can see that. And we have a single channel now for coming in through that. And then we will then look at that. We will triage it slightly, if I'm honest about it. It depends a little bit what we're doing. If you said, I need an MRI scanner or something, that's going to take us a bit longer to procure. And then we will look at that, and then we'll come back and say, yes, let's have an initial engagement meeting. That will usually still be with me and another member of the team. And then we, as I said, we have this decision process. So we decide that we're going forward, exchange an NDA. And then we'll designate one member of the team. There's quite a big 13 of us in the team now, to sort of take a role on that. But every member of the team gets copied into everything. So if someone's off sick or away or something, we can move. So it's a fairly well-developed process. And we'll guide the company through very carefully what needs to be done.
So it's really, get in contact to find out if you can help, how you can help, and what the process could look like, and get in contact as early as possible, because that's how you can prevent future issues happening potentially.
That's true. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, some stuff that comes along needs very little doing to it. It works really well, but it's nice to know that.
Yeah.
And then we can also signpost you to getting to the first in human, which is the next logical step, really. We don't do, as I said, large randomized controlled trials. We'll signpost you to people that do, but that's not been our specialty. And we just don't want to tread in. We're very careful not to play in other people's areas which we don't have skills in.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor, on this podcast.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure. It's been very enjoyable. And I hope some of it's useful.
I think it's really interesting to understand how companies work with you, when they should engage with you, and, what they should be thinking about really around usability testing. So, but I think the main message is people need to get in contact if they want to look at usability testing, and then they can understand if it's right for them or not.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Amazing. Lovely. Well, thank you for watching today's episode of the Medical Device Marketing Podcast. We hope you have a fantastic day, and we look forward to seeing you very soon.